Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Masa Sugiyama. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. Today, I'm going to talk about how the IPCC Working Group 3 report has addressed SRM and its governance. So here's how the Working Group 3 report covered the Solar Radiation Modification, or SRM, or sometimes referred to as solar geoengineering. Perhaps because of its controversial nature, there is no mention in the summary for policymakers, and there's only a short coverage of this topic in the technical summary, or TS. Basically, it says international cooperation is emerging, but inadequate. Still, there's a substantial coverage of SRM within the main text. In chapter 3, there's a substantial coverage of SRM and scenarios based on integrated assessment models. And in chapter 14, there's a cross-working group box on SRM. And it covers a number of topics such as proposed solar radiation schemes, how the scenario, the relationship between scenarios and evaluation of SRM risks to human and natural systems, and potential for risk reduction, public perceptions of SRM, ethics, and finally, governance of research and deployment. Since this is also shows up in the Working Group 2 report, Chris Trissas covered this topic fairly broadly in the previous webinar by C2G. And chapter 14 also talks about international governance of SRM. So what is SRM? Solar radiation modification, or solar geoengineering. It refers to proposals to increase the reflection of sunlight back into space in order to counteract human-induced warming and some of its harmful impacts. It's a novel option to deal with climate change, and it would not address the root cause of climate change, the increasing concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and also bring about novel risks. So it would not address ocean acidification because it doesn't reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But why we talk about SRM is it can provide some climate risk reduction. And one of the most important messages from this report is that SRM cannot be the main policy response to climate change, and is at best a supplement to achieving sustained net zero or net negative CO2 emission levels globally. So it can help, but it's not the main one. In the future, if emissions reductions in the CDR are considered or perceived as inefficient, SRM may be seen by some people as the only option left to achieve the 1.5 degree or 2 degrees target temperature goals. So that's why we are talking about it. We don't have to use it, and even in the best case, it would be a supplement. Please remember that. SRM is an umbrella term. It covers a number of different subcategories. So the most studied one, the option is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. The idea is to inject reflected aerosol particles high up in the atmosphere, or a gas that then gets converted to aerosols. And these particles, small particles or aerosols, they reflect sunlight back to space. Sunlight can be reflected at different locations. So when it is reflected by marine clouds, it's called the marine cloud brightening. And if it's reflected at the surface of the oceans, it's ocean albedo change. Or you can make the surface more reflective, or maybe it could be rooftops, but the roofs, but the ground-based albedo modification is another category. The last one, cirrus cloud thinning. Technically, this is not SRM, but because it intervenes in the Earth radiation budget, it is often discussed along with other SRM options. SRM risks and its ability to reduce climate risks all these depend on the way SRM is used, including scale, timing, and type, etc. There is no DSRM. When you hear something like SRM does that, does this, you need some caveats. So here's a diagram from the special report on global warming 1.5 degrees, published in 2018. And this is a small scale temporary deployment scenario. So let's say with substantial mitigation, we achieve this kind of temperature curve into the future. But unfortunately, the temperature would exceed the 1.5 degree threshold without SRM. So you could deploy SRM to cut off this shaded area. This is just one of many possible scenarios. You could, of course, deploy SRM on a large scale, and such a deployment scenario could bring about substantial SRM risks. And of course, we can choose not to use SRM at all. And that's the key point. There's no DSRM. It depends on our choice about how to use it and what kind of what kind of SRM we're going to use. The cross-working group box also covers public perception and ethics. The publics are largely unaware of SRM based on the previous research, based on the interviews and the surveys. The surveyed respondents tend to reject deployment for the foreseeable future, but they tend to conditionally, cautiously support the need for more research because they think it is better to understand its risks and benefits. Unfortunately, studies are biased toward the global north. There are a handful of studies that have looked at the perceptions in the global south and developing countries, but that's pretty small in terms of share. In terms of ethics, there is a concern about moral hazard. This is about, so if the publics get to know about SRM, they would have reduced incentives and the motivation for reduced emissions. But the empirical evidence is complicated and limited. There is also worry about the slippery slope. So once you start research or demonstration, then that could create a vested interest or dedicated community, and that could start basically the whole process blocking in the society into SRM, and we would eventually do a large-scale SRM deployment. But it's difficult to ascertain whether this would happen or not. Lastly, this is a point already said above, but there's a need to involve global south and the vulnerable communities because discussion has been biased toward the global north or developed countries. Chapter 14 also covers the SRM governance of research and deployment. There is no international law that directly governs SRM. There are relevant international treaties, such as the Convention on Biodiversity, and the London Convention and London Protocol on Marine Pollution, but they do not directly address SRM. So there needs to be some work to be done. Because the science on SRM is at an early stage, depending on the perspective, some flexibility would be useful to facilitate research. But we need some oversight, and too little restriction would be problematic. Conversely, if we restrict research too much, that would stifle potential innovation. So, in other words, science and governance is expected to grow and evolve together. So co-evolution is the key theme. In terms of near-term priorities, there's some proposal to address, so here's a list of certain things that could be addressed. So the first is to guard against the potential risks and harm. The second is to enable appropriate research and the development of scientific knowledge. Third, to legitimize any future research or policymaking through public and expert engagement. And four, ensure the SRM is considered only as a supplement with a priority on mitigation. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.